The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. TIAA makes you a retirement promise, a promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. Learn more at TIAA.org/promises pay off.
LinkedIn presents.
Your perception of effort during a difficult task is more important than any actual physiological signals from your muscles. And this applies to demanding cognitive and social tasks as well. So if you want to push harder, work smarter, and achieve more, sometimes the first step is to tell yourself that you're about to do just that.
Happy Friday, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Kovnat, and this is the Next Big Idea Daily. It's the show that in under 15 minutes brings you insights from the latest nonfiction delivered to you by the authors themselves. Be sure to click the follow button in your podcast player if you haven't already, and sign up for our newsletters using the link in the episode notes. Now, this Sunday, the 2024 Summer Olympics will wrap up with a closing ceremony in Paris. So let's go ahead and close out our week of special episodes celebrating athletes and the life lessons we can all learn from them. To do that, I wanted to bring back an old friend of the Next Big Idea Club, author Alex Hutchinson. Alex is a National Magazine Award-winning journalist who writes a regular column for Outside Magazine. He's a former physicist, and he's also someone who knows his way around the track, having been a middle and long-distance runner for the Canadian national team. Alex brought together all his interests in the 2018 book Endure: Mind, Body, and the Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance. It's a book that became a New York Times bestseller and was beloved by our Next Big Idea Club curators as well. Malcolm Gladwell said, "This book is amazing." And Adam Grant said, "It makes the case that we're actually underestimating our potential and reveals how we can all surpass our perceived physical limits." Here's Alex to share some of his big ideas.
When you think about endurance, you often think about wiry little marathoners running for hours at a time. But endurance is actually a much broader concept. Think about 100-meter sprinters like Usain Bolt. 100-meter sprinters tend to reach their maximum speed after about 50 or 60 meters, and then they're slowing down for the rest of the race. Usain Bolt, he's able to sustain his peak speed just a little bit longer. He had better endurance than his rivals. And if you look at his 200-meter world record, you'll notice that he didn't go through halfway in the same time as his 100-meter world record. He was pacing himself. He had to start more slowly. Because even for a 20-second effort, endurance requires a mental effort to distribute your effort maximally. And at the totally opposite end of the spectrum, you can look at examples like LeBron James. In the 2015 NBA playoffs, he basically ran out of gas. He was calling for himself to be pulled out of the game because he could barely move, he couldn't hit shots. This wasn't necessarily because his muscles were exhausted. He was still getting lots of sleep and getting massage and all that. His brain was tired. He was exhausted. He had played 18,000 game minutes in the previous years, which was more than 2,000 minutes more than anybody else in the league. So for someone like LeBron James, endurance was a mental challenge, and that's something that's true for all of us. We all understand that physical fatigue is real. If you're running a marathon, you plan a week or two of easy training leading up to it to make sure you'll be at your best. But researchers are now realizing that mental fatigue is real too. Even just staring at a computer screen for a few hours can cause changes in your brain chemistry that hurt your performance. And there are ways of counteracting this mental fatigue, some of them obvious, like caffeine, and some of them unexpected, like a brain endurance training app that the British military has started experimenting with. Bottom line is that taking mental breaks and ensuring that you're mentally fresh is as important as your physical state. In May of 2017, I flew to Italy to watch one of the most unusual races I've ever seen. It was a special marathon put on a Formula One track by Nike, who had spent tens of millions of dollars trying to arrange for runners to break the 2-hour marathon barrier. And in the end, the winner was a guy named Eliud Kipchoge, who's a marathoner from Kenya. He's the Olympic champion. And he ran 2 hours, 0 minutes, and 25 seconds, which is a phenomenal performance that everyone was struggling to understand afterwards. And one of the things that people were talking about is that he had seemed to enjoy himself. He had been smiling broadly during the second half of the race, a time when most marathoners are in excruciating pain. He was grinning to himself. And when we asked him about it afterwards, he said this was a deliberate tactic. He was smiling basically in order to convince his legs that they felt okay, to convince himself that he was enjoying this and that he could continue to push himself. This may sound like a sort of wishful thinking kind of approach, but there's actually some science emerging suggesting that, yeah, you can influence your performance by doing things like smiling. A study came out a few months after that race showing that telling yourself to smile while running lowers the amount of energy you're burning to maintain a given pace by about 2%, which is highly significant. So this is something Kipchoge has continued to do. He did it later that year at the Berlin Marathon, where he won against some of the best marathoners in the world. There he was, running the last half of the race, smiling. And so I think it's a pretty powerful example of the fact that how you approach efforts, how you frame it in your own mind, can make a big difference to what you're able to achieve. How you perform in any high-pressure situation is influenced by all sorts of subtle cues that you might not be aware of. Even subliminal messages work. When researchers flash pictures of smiling faces onto a screen in totally imperceptible 16-millisecond bursts, cyclists last 12% longer in an endurance test. And the content of your internal narrative, saying, "You're ready for this," as opposed to "this hurts," has a measurable effect on physical performance. This is because your perception of effort during a difficult task is more important than any actual physiological signals from your muscles. And this applies to demanding cognitive and social tasks as well. So if you want to push harder, work smarter, and achieve more, sometimes the first step is to tell yourself that you're about to do just that. When I was a junior in college, I figured that I'd pretty much hit the absolute limits of my own endurance. I was a 1,500-meter runner, which is a little bit shorter than a mile, and I really wanted to break 4 minutes for the 1,500. But I'd been stuck running about 4:01 or 4:02 for 4 years since I was in high school. And I figured that was just about what my body could do and that I might be able to run 3:59 if I had a perfect day. What happened though is one day at a really small meet in a place called Sherbrooke in Quebec, every lap during a race, the timekeeper tells you how fast you're going. He reads out a split. And in this case, the split that I heard after the first lap of this race was 27 seconds for the first 200, which is way faster than I had ever run for a 1,500, way faster than I'd planned to run. But I felt great. And the second lap came by and the split was 57 seconds, which again, way faster than I'd ever gotten. And I thought, something's going on here today. This is my day because I feel like I'm running totally relaxed and yet I've come through in 57 seconds. So I stopped paying attention to the splits and I just ran as hard as I could to the finish line. And when I finished, I had run 3:52. It was a 9-second personal best after years of training with no apparent change in my fitness or in my training. When I debriefed with my teammates, they'd been timing it and they said, "No, you didn't go out in 27 seconds. It was more like 30 or 31. And 57 seconds at 400, no, you were more like 60. So the timekeeper had been calling out the wrong splits. I still don't know exactly what happened, but the point is that with no physical change, just a little bit of deception, I had broken through to a completely different level. And the postscript is actually what's most interesting to me, because after this huge breakthrough, the next race I ran, after running 3:52, I ran 3:49. And the race after that, I ran 3:44, which qualified me for that summer's Olympic trials in Canada. So somehow discovering that I was capable of more than I'd expected created a lasting change in my endurance. It totally made me into a different athlete. It turns out that my story isn't just a freak accident. In fact, scientists have found that deception, whether it's deliberate or accidental, is one of the most powerful ways of bridging the gap between what the brain thinks you can do and what the body can actually do. For example, if someone rigs a thermometer to display a temperature that's lower than it really is, you'll be able to push harder in hot weather than if you actually know how hot it is. In the real world, it's not always easy to trick yourself. But there are ways of manipulating your expectations that can help you push yourself beyond what seems initially feasible. At the 2008 Olympics in Beijing, a swimmer named Sara Isakovic from Slovenia was contending for a medal when she went into the last lap. And as she did her turn, she flipped under the water, stuck her feet out, and felt nothing. Instead of bursting off the wall to swim for a medal, she just grazed the wall with the tip of her toes. And that's bad news. And that could have been the end of her race, because the thoughts going through her head were, why me? Why now? Why is this happening? But fortunately, she's a very elite athlete, both physically and mentally. And she was able to very quickly reframe her thoughts and focus again on her goal and what she'd done to get there. And she finished that race faster than she'd ever finished before. She ended up with a silver medal, just a fraction of a section outside of the gold medal. And I met Sara a couple years later when I visited the University of California, San Diego, where they were doing some really interesting brain research onto the origins of resilience. Why do some people manage to push themselves to their maximum when it counts most? And they were taking elite athletes and Navy SEALs and other top performers and putting them in a brain scanner and then having them breathe through a special mask where they would sometimes then restrict the flow of air so that you'd have trouble breathing. And all the time they were scanning which areas of the brain were active, and they were making them do cognitive tasks to see how their performance responded to this stress. And what they found is that the elite performers, they were always very conscious of monitoring signals from their body. They were always aware of how they felt. And when the stress started, they just kept monitoring. They didn't overreact or underreact. And that was totally the opposite of most people who aren't really paying attention to how their body feels until something goes wrong, and then they totally overreact. And so the elite athletes were able to perform their best under pressure, whereas most of the rest of us perform our worst. And Sarah Isakovich's story is a great example of that. It's an example of how endurance depends on being able to tune into the signals from your body without overreacting or panicking as a result of them. The best endurers are amazing at monitoring how their bodies feel in great detail, but they're also able to suspend judgment about these feelings. This is textbook mindfulness, and the great thing is that you can get better at it. In the 1970s, John Kabat-Zinn developed an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction course. And since then, others have developed modified versions that specifically address the needs of athletes and other specific groups. Mindfulness has gotten a lot of hype lately, but endurance is one area where the latest brain science suggests it can make a big difference. Jens Voigt was never the most talented cyclist in the Tour de France. But there was something special about him. There's a reason he had such a big fan following. He was the hard man of the peloton, is what he was called. And his motto was, "Shut up, legs." That's what he would tell himself when rides got hard. He was famous for being willing to suffer pain. All endurance athletes have to deal with discomfort. But there's something to the idea that some are willing to suffer more than others and dig a little deeper. So it was really appropriate that Voigt decided at the end of his career to tackle the 1-hour record. This is probably the most painful record in cycling. Basically, you go on a velodrome, you cycle for 1 hour on one bike with one gear. There's no tactics, nothing going on except pain. And the physiology of riding for an hour is unique, and it's just between two thresholds, your critical power and your lactate threshold. That basically means it's the longest possible time you can sustain a high-intensity, painful effort. And sure enough, Voigt, even though he was in his 40s, at the very end of his career, he was able to cycle 51.11 kilometers in 1 hour, which was almost a mile farther than the previous record. So the question is, was Jens Voigt really a great cyclist because he could suffer more than anyone else? It turns out that there actually is some evidence that pain and performance are linked, that people who are able to suffer a little more are able to dig deeper and get more out of their bodies. And learning to do that is something that we can all do. The hard truth is that sometimes endurance hurts. And even the greatest athletes feel pain just like the rest of us. The difference is that they're able to endure that pain for longer. Over the course of years of grueling workouts, they've developed psychological strategies to cope with discomfort. They distract themselves. They reframe pain as emotionally neutral information rather than an alarm signal. To push the limits of your endurance, you need to get comfortable being uncomfortable.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Well, that was our closing ceremony, but just for this week. Unlike the Olympics, we'll be back Monday with a fresh batch of big ideas for you. In the meantime, please leave us a rating or review in your podcast player, which will help others find the show. This week's episodes were written by me, Michael Kovnat, and edited by Caleb Bissinger. The next Big Idea Daily is part of the LinkedIn Podcast Network. We'll see you Monday.